Good. You're live.
We're live. All right, good morning. It's 9:03 Beach Preservation Ad Hoc Committee meeting, Friday, May 3rd. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and public were duly notified of the meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. So on the phone today, we have Dan Schlosser and Steve Trainum. Primary focus of today is continued discussion of the optimal beach profile and goals for future beach conditions. So Desiree or Douglas, anything to open, or Stephen, let him kind of take it away?
So yes, at our last committee meeting, we discussed how a lot of the policies and when it comes to beach preservation and funding will really fall in line once we determine what the ideal beach profile is for the city. And we had a meeting a few weeks ago with Stephen, who showed a lot of technical information associated with how to determine what the ideal beach profile is and how does that look in the different reaches of our beach. So we've asked Stephen to continue that conversation with us this morning in an effort to try to nail down what that would look like, and we can put it in a model, in a financial model, to identify how much that would cost the city and how often the city would need to plan to renourish the beach to maintain that. So Stephen, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, I can have a few comments, but I'll kind of look for a decent amount of feedback from y'all on, what we presented last time. We were really kind of focused on the south end, and I'm curious if the goal of today is to continue that kind of focus on the south end, or were you looking to expand that over the entire beach? It doesn't, I'm comfortable either way with that, but Desiree, do you have a?
Yeah, Stephen, I think it's the entire beach needs to be the conversation.
Yep, I agree with that.
I'm sorry?
The entire beach needs to be the conversation.
Okay, entire beach.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So when we discussed last time, we used the model of 450 cubic yards per foot as the minimum healthy beach profile. I think after discussions of that, felt like that was probably a little high based off the actual conditions that, we really pinned down on the existing condition and what some of the beach volumes were. 400 number really is, I think, closer to what we would want to use for that. And I had a conversation with Doug about what really does that mean with the idea of this minimum beach volume. As far as planning future projects and building your funding model, the minimum healthy beach volume really only comes into play, again, this is in theory, when you're putting things on paper, when you're looking at doing your initial nourishment to get the beach to a minimum standard. Anything after that, maintenance projects really are more of a function of what the documented erosion rates are. So when you're planning your financial models, there's one part that's getting back this deficit volume, that's the minimum healthy beach condition. And that's where we can pick a number, 400 to 450 cubic yards per foot. And it's fairly simple to come up with the existing deficit volume. So I looked at it again using that 400-foot number, and that dropped our deficit volume at the south end to about 340,000 yards. Which was a pretty significant decrease from what we were looking at earlier, which was closer to 600,000 cubic yards. But again, that only goes into the initial project if you were to start a program from scratch. What the more important number in the future is going to be what is the historical erosion rate, and that's where we look at our data for the past 15 years or so, and I'll kind of stay focused on the south end right now. When we've measured the breach inlet section since 2009, and we've had surveys there every year. Between 2009 and, sorry, move my computer around here. Between 2009 and 2021, if we add up the total volume change from Breach Inlet to the South Beach, including Front Beach, the volumes are dynamic, but they're fluctuating around the mean. So you have a year where you'll gain 75,000 yards, and then another year where you'll lose 50,000 yards, and it comes back and forth. And you'll have, there's 3 years where you lost sand each year, and then you gain some sand back. But if you add up from 2009 to 2021, the net change south of the pier was only a loss of 74,000 yards, which is about 6,200 cubic yards per year. So if you use that as your model of this is the amount of sand that we anticipate losing every year, that you come up with, okay, for every 10 years, we need to add 70,000 yards. Yeah, it's a pretty low number. But where it gets tricky is the last 2 years, from 21 to 23, those two reaches have lost about 340,000 yards. So it's a huge increase in erosion just these last 2 years. So from the engineering standpoint, we don't want to, in normal conditions, we wouldn't take these 2 years as what we anticipate the future trend to be. These are kind of outlier years. Or at least we're anticipating they're outlier years, and the erosion rate is much return something much more close to the historical rate, because there's really been no significant physical change that has suggested there's a long-term trend with these rates.
Stephen, just a
But
question.
if we were just to look at, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, they're on. Stephen, just a question on that. What would you use to determine whether or not the last 2 years are just an anomaly, or if it's something that we should be prepared for in the future to see erosion at that same rate?
Yeah, so we would look at, obvious things that are obviously not there, like somebody built a structure that has changed, doesn't transport. There's been these are big picture things. Somebody built a dam that's cut off sand supply. There's been some significant project that has robbed sand from coming there that hasn't before. The only thing we can really point to is, more localized natural changes with the inlet and with, short-term waves of sand or lack of sand that's come through that area over the past 2 years. From 21 to 22, we lost 95,000 yards, which was high. We lost 120,000 yards between 2010 and 2011. So that 95 number was high, but not something we haven't seen. We've seen gains from 19 to 20, we saw a gain of 97,000 yards. So that was within the realm of, what we've seen before. The next year was 250,000 yards, and that was just a complete outlier from all of our prior data. But if you're building a financial model and we're basing it off these past 2 years, then, we're looking at needing to add 100,000 yards of sand or more every year to account for these losses. And so now you're looking at, 1 million yards of sand every 10 years instead of 100 to 200,000 yards of sand every 2 years. So again, we're looking at a couple of different things with the initial volume and then, which is the deficit volume. The idea of the ideal beach profile is a good place to start, but it's not the critical component of long-term planning. So
I guess,
I'll
is
kind of
there,
stop talking for a second if there's questions on that. The similar, I will say the similar cases for the east end, or for the east end of the island. I was looking at the volumes, and I think that 400 is again a good criteria to say it's a standard to say what areas are eroded, what areas we feel like are in decent condition right now, But we know how the erosion is persisting or is continuing there. You're really looking at your larger scale changes. So you just want to be careful moving forward with planning that's completely designed around that ideal profile, if that makes sense.
Is there not a way, though, to have some sort of insurance policy? I mean, so we're gonna, just like your health insurance, you've got your normal day-to-day maintenance, but then you have a catastrophic, something, so that when bad things happen, you're not, you're not starting off, you're not paying for it either all out of pocket, all at once, or, I mean, I think that's kind of where we are right now, is that we've been in this maintenance program, which is fine, for the most part, it works. I mean, you look at the data and it looks like we're pretty good, and then all of a sudden you get 2 years where we're not. And I understand what you're saying, that it's probably not reasonable to plan for that every single year, but it seems like we do need something, and that's where the Corps of Engineers, to me, struck a chord, because that was kind of that insurance.
Yeah, and that's completely right. I think we look at it as, here's kind of a standard, and so as you're monitoring your beach, so say a project is done that builds the beach out, well advanced of that minimum healthy volume. But then you start tracking it each year, and you have that line as, okay, here's our standard that we're trying to maintain, and if we know we're 100 yards per foot over that standard, and the monitoring starting to show that you're losing 15 yards per foot every year, then years or so, if everything stays the same, you're going to hit that standard. So then, 3 years, you start planning for the next project so that you're able to implement a project before that line's hit. So that's really what it is that kind of measuring stick to say what's healthy and what's not. And it allows you to kind of plan for that future. So I think that's the way that we would like to try to employ it. It does help with the deficit volume to kind of design your initial projects, but then it's always kind of your standard or your barometer of overall beach conditions.
Yeah, Steve.
Forecasting to when are we going to hit that condition, and how far ahead of it do we need to get with permits and financial planning, that type of thing.
Steve, would it be possible, this is Scott, would it be possible to maybe, I think what I'm hearing, we've got really two almost separate exercises here. One is to give you the parameters for what the baseline ideal beach is. I think you call it the initial renourishment. I don't know that that's going to change much based on where we are. If it's, I think you're asking us to decide, is it 400 cubic yards or is it 450? I guess my question back to you would be, and I think you said on the south end, it'd be a difference of a couple 100,000 cubic yards. Would it be worthwhile or possible to, price out what both of those are to get the initial renourishment? So that way we've got, we got two numbers, we can make an assessment, and it sounds like a lot of the cost, or the majority of the cost, is in the initial setup, and I don't know what the difference in sand volume in pricing, requires if it's a huge number. But
that's a very easy thing to do, and run a couple of scenarios on the ideal condition, and essentially you're going to come up with, there's going to be some volume gap between the two, and let's say it's 200,000 yards. So that 200,000 yards, and you just use your unit price of sand pumping, say that's $15 a yard. So, your price difference is going to be $3.5 million between those two scenarios. But we'd be able to kind of give you what the difference in existing conditions between those two scenarios looks like, in the real world. Is it a dune field that's 70 feet wide versus a dune field that's 120 feet wide? And that's where, there's an engineering approach to it, but there's also kind of I'll call it a political approach. That's not the right word, but just kind of a community perception on what are we happy with, visually, aesthetically, with that condition. And they do need to, you want them to try to meet up and overlap so that, you healthy beach from the engineering condition, but you also have something that homeowners and residents are going to be feel comfortable with.
Yeah, and on that second part was, what I thought I heard was, we're going to have to take some advice from yourself and others on what are these go-forward assumptions, I think to Katie's point as well. Do we use the last 2 years? I think when you were talking about these events that could impact the go-forward, I think you mentioned about 4 or 5, the dam and the wall or whatever, that is pretty much man-made, but then you mentioned Breach Inlet. Sounds like there's been some natural changes. And I guess the question I'd have, and it might impact and same with the north end, at the inlets, if the inlets have changed and we think these are now with changes and things of that nature a little bit more permanent, how do we weave that in? Because the prior 20 years may not be indicative either, and the last 2 years may not be indicative, but maybe somehow we got to marry the two and come to more of a realistic approach.
Yeah, anything happening with the inlet is going to be cyclical, and you're going to get periods where it's going to flip back, and should be in a more accretional period. Now, we may not recover everything we've lost naturally, but I would think we would greatly reduce our rates a lot closer to the historical average. But certainly there could be an increase in that. So, I wouldn't, if we were planning for a very low erosion rate based off the historical trends, say 10,000 yards a year, every 10 years, 100,000 yards, that's likely a project that could be accomplished via dredging the waterway. Those volumes should be well within that type of scale. If you're looking at, again, 100,000 yards of a year erosion, then really that's probably more sand that's available in the waterway if they dredge it every 5 years. That may be there, but you're much more likely to look at a large-scale nourishment. So that greatly affects your forecast model for funding and all of that. So
I think Dan.
Let me get
had-
hey,
he's got
Dan,
a
you
few
got
minutes, so.
Dan, you have a question?
I did. I wanted to follow up on one of the points that was brought up. So, Stephen, you said you can come up with an estimate of what it would take to repair the beach back to whether it's 400 or 450 now. And my question was, can you also come up with an estimate as to when the next time is, assuming things are kind of consistent with where they are, that we'll need to do a new renourishment, a full renourishment? Let's just guess 5 years, and what the projected cost would be to do that based on what you think will happen based on where we are. Because one of the things that the committee, as I understand it, is charged with is trying to figure out a way to raise funds or to generate the monies necessary, especially in light of the lack of state or federal funding without some emergent situation. And it seems like the best way for us to do it is to figure out what is our projected cost so we can know what it's going to take not only to do the renourishment project that's ahead of us, but also if it's going to be 5 years, what that is going to be projected at, so we can figure out how do we accomplish raising or having enough money set aside to do that. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, and that's kind of the way we typically approach a long-term plan. If it's a 30-year plan, we identify the historical erosion rate, the deficit volume, and then different scenarios on, if you were to, based off those rates, if you're nourishing your beach every 8 years, you have to add a certain amount of sand. If you try to get 10 years out of it, you need to add more. And what those projections look like when you add in the mobilization for each project, inflation for construction prices and things like that. So it's kind of the standard practice to do that type of analysis. And my initial kind of thoughts or recommendation right now would be to pick an erosion rate that's, I would say around 50,000 yards a year, which is substantially more than the historical rate, but it doesn't overweight just the past 2 years. And then you're looking at a 500,000 yard volume every 10 years, which there's a couple of, when you're doing a offshore dredging project, there's kind of a minimum amount of sand that you need to place to make it cost effective. And that's getting around that 500,000 yard number. You can do a little lower, but that's getting close to the minimum volume that dredgers like to place if it's an independent standalone project. If it was a project kind of coupled with work at the east end, and they've already got equipment there, and you could get away with doing even a little bit less.
Well,
that's kind of the,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, but that's kind of the scale where I think we would land on an appropriate, deficit volume, or, sorry, appropriate,
Maintenance.
monitoring or, average annual volume wise. If we include the last 2 years from 2009 all the way to 2023, the average volume loss is about 30,000 yards per year. So it's still very conservative, but it's going to give you a higher number to plan for financially.
Is that for the whole island, Steve? I'm
My
sorry.
my concern was with the mobilization cost being so much, are we better to do the 450 or even more if it buys us more time,
Only that end.
as opposed to having to do the renourishment sooner and have that mobilization cost, which I understood could be like $5 million.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of advantages to trying to get a 10-year project because it's much more likely to be able to kind of do that along with a East End project that has been on about a 10-year interval. You're obviously reducing mobilization, but you're also reducing the impact to the beach with beach closures and the environmental impacts of dredging, and then being able to spread out the economies of scale. So there are a lot of advantages of trying to get on a higher frequency. Now, again, with the Corps doing this beneficial use project, their plan is to continue to do beneficial use projects using sand dredged from the waterway, and that's typically been done every 4 to 5 years, I believe, in Breach Inlet. So if that's the case, again, I would think the city would still want to plan for the worst as if you're doing your own independent project. But if 4 years into the life of the last project, the Corps comes in and adds another 100 to 200,000 yards of sand, then that's great. We would have to make those kind of adjustments as we go in our planning. But you would certainly want to take that sand. If we're back into historical rates, that 100,000 yards every 5 years would be enough to compensate for annual losses. And that you may not have to do anything here, which would be ideal. But yeah, thanks for the worst.
I've got a question for you, because it's kind of a history. We renourished in 2007 and 2008, and you said it's going to last about 8 to 10 years. And then in 2017, 18, we had another renourishment, which is built right into your plan here. But it said it would last 8 to 10 years. And now we have 2024, where we have a beach renourishment that's needed. So we're losing a little ground here. So there's a pattern developing which falls into that 8 to 6 year period where the beach needs to be renourished. So wouldn't it be beneficial to have a proactive plan to get, we know it's going to happen every at least 8 to 10 years. So why can't we plan on it and use the sand that flows into the inlets on both ends and use that sand to pump back onto the beach?
Tim, one thing to keep in mind, on the north end, which is the only area we've done major renourishment before, between 2008 and 2018, those two large projects,
Yeah.
the city did 2 shoal management projects. So taking advantage of the sand that was attaching through that natural shoal attachment process. And that was able to, we were able to leverage that sand to allow that project to last 10 years. And that's the same pattern we're using this go-round. When our last project was in 2018, we have a shoal management project, shoal management permit application in for the north end. And
Let me just say something, because I got to step out of the meeting in a second, but on the north end, it's horrible right now. and it's not gonna make it 10 years, and it hasn't made it to 10 years, so I don't like that number frame, and I don't like the idea of trying to plan a 10-year plan. I think we're much safer. It seems like it's wiser to plan for a shorter period, and if after 5 or 6 years, we're not having the same problems, then maybe adjust it at the next time. But the 10 years has historically been an issue, and I think we're better to be safer than sorry, so we're not back in the same position where we're worried about how do we raise the monies to do something because we underestimated what was going to be necessary. Hey guys, thank you for your time. I'm sorry, but I do have to drop off.
Thank you, Dan.
I'll listen to the rest of this later on. You guys have a great night.
Well, back to what you were saying about 2018, the south end didn't get the 600,000 cubic yards that was in the permit, the dredging permit or project of 2018. It didn't get that sand. So they were and they were projecting with that 600,000 cubic yards that the south end would get 75 feet of dry sandy beach. And we never got that. So it kind of seems like that's why the south end is a little behind the 8 ball here. We didn't have that buffer of 600,000 or anything. And that's why the erosion went so quickly, in my opinion. I'm not an expert on it, but you can watch it daily. So I think we need to kind of cut it down from like a 10-year period, like Dan was saying, to a 5-year plan, 4-year plan. At least plan for have the money available and get the permitting. If we don't need it, we don't use it, and we can roll it over to the next period.
So Stephen, I mean, I think that's a good kind of question for the group. It's my understanding that at 2018, so you're right, there was kind of this permission in the permit to put 600,000 cubic yards on the southern end when we mobilized. But I think the analysis at that time showed us that the beach was healthy, probably beyond what we're talking about being an ideal beach profile. And that's why the decision was made, it wouldn't be cost effective to kind of bump it out to a 600 cubic yard beach profile. And I wonder in hindsight, well, and obviously we had those 2 bad years, but Stephen, kind of, how would you describe, is that accurate to say that at 2018, when that project was done, the southern end was so healthy that it didn't warrant the project? And if that was the decision then, now seeing what we're seeing and kind of revising our erosion rates to be a little more updated based on the last 2 years, would we have made that same decision today? And should that kind of be an example of, even though it almost seemed illogical at the time to spend $3 million to pump onto a beach that had 450 cubic yards of sand, it might seem illogical to do that, but maybe we should have done it. And maybe going forward, that would be, if we mobilize, we just spend the extra money. I mean, the city would be scrutinized for spending public dollars to put onto a beach that appears to be enormous. So I think it would be kind of counterintuitive to do it, but maybe we can use this example of, we should have done it, maybe. I don't know, that's a question.
If I understand your question, to Stephen, is there such thing as too healthy a beach? And can we make it healthier than what it was? Can you improve its health for its longevity?
Do you kind of
right?
bulge so far
Is that-
out that it's shearing off quicker, you're getting less use out of it?
So
Kind
I
of
get,
the question.
that's,
Yeah, so to answer kind of that last question, can you have too healthy of a beach? In most cases, I would say no, though we have gotten public comments before that the beach is too wide, it's difficult to get your beach chairs and take it out through the dunes, through the sand to it. So that's a side issue. But
yeah.
right around inlets, you can build out too far where you're starting to build protrusion into areas where currents are going to basically shear off that protrusion. So if you're, kind of working around the corner of an inlet, I would say, yeah, you can't be just doing more. Well, if you're not hurting anything, you're just throwing a lot of money at sand that's not going to be there very long in those types of conditions. So, as you get right to the end of the front beach section of Breach Inlet, you could be running into that type of thing. And with, won't go into details of design too much, but to go back to the first question about the 2018 project, that section was considered kind of at the last minute in response to some focused erosion that occurred as we were in the permitting process. At that point, I believe the idea was that we would add that in, and if erosion continued to get worse, then we would try to figure out a way to add that portion in. At that point, there wasn't funding identified. I think the city's budget was going to be pretty much exhausted from the east endward. And the bar area, we would have had to use sand from the eastern end of the island, which would have been a much, but it would have been a higher unit cost to pump sand to that end. And you would have had some additional mobilization because they would have to bring in more pipe. So it was going to be a little bit more of an extensive effort just from the logistics of it and the short time frame. We did not have a bar area identified for that was closer to the south end. That's something we're working on now. And when it came closer to time of construction, the beach had restored. I think that was one of the years where they did nearly 100,000 yards of sand. So it built back out. I think Dry Sand probably built close to 100 feet in some areas there around Breach Inlet. So we felt like, okay, well, that was a short-term erosion event, and we're going to be okay. So there was a lot of different things that kind of played into that. Knowing that the erosion rates were going to accelerate in the future, past few years, I'm sure we would have said that we'd like to have more sand on the beach to account for that. And going off the data that we did, and the conditions, financial conditions at the time, that really wasn't much of an effort made to, really look into moving forward with that.
Well, is there any consideration of using the
My
inlets?
recollection at that time.
Is there any consideration of using the inlets for the sand replenishment as a source? Because from the naked eye and from the uneducated person here, you just see the sand migrating down to the inlets. And it just seems like, why not use that sand and put it back on the beach where we don't have to go offshore to dredge out? Wouldn't it be more cost effective
Yeah,
that way?
that's certainly, that's certainly a feasible project. In 2018, we would have had to essentially created a completely new permit application for that type project because it's a different, but and any work around an inlet has potential impacts for sensitive fish habitat. And then we would have also had to kind of coordinate with Sullivan's Island on how a project in the inlet may impact them. And we had a discussion with them a couple of weeks ago with the committee on what a project like that may look like. So it's something that can be done, but it also will involve using a ocean certified dredge, which you're going to have a significant mobilization charge with that. Again, if you can piggyback it with a project in the east end, a lot of that would be reduced. But it is a fairly expensive project by itself.
As I've understood the kind of economics of that question, you can get your best bang for the buck doing shoal management, kind of via scraping and trucking on that spit of land. But to actually dredge, you are paying for an ocean-going dredge because it's beyond this line. And at the point of you're paying for an ocean-going dredge, it's not that much more to put them farther off, and then you're adding volume to the sand, where if you're working in that inlet, you are taking sand that's naturally on its way to Sullivan's Island and also eroding. So I think it becomes a little bit more to go a little bit farther out and be adding sand to the sandbox that kind of nobody would have any issue with. versus taking it from somebody potentially where it's going to somebody else,
But
which creates
is the
controversy.
inlet interfering with the natural flow? Is that creating a dam?
I think that's been answered. Everything's just no.
Ask
The
me.
volume of water is moving back and forth regularly. So you're not, if it
Well, it's
was creating a
depositing
dam,
at-
you'd have more water on the island.
But it's
or in the
depositing at the inlet.
The physics of that it doesn't match. The volume of water that goes in has to go out, that it is exiting and entering the same volume of space. So with the tide changes, so unless you saw an increase of water backlogging somewhere else, which would have to accumulate somewhere inland of that inlet,
Well, according to some people that live on the creek, it is backlogging. They've experienced way higher tides,
Down on Hammer Creek.
so.
Well, we're all getting higher tides.
Well,
yeah,
the theory, some of the theory is that it's being stopped by the inlets.
But the water level is universally
still told us that that's
flat
not happening.
everywhere. There's no, the water's no higher on the back than it is on the front.
Every expert we've asked this question has said that that is not happening. I mean, there
Just-
comes a point where we have to believe in our experts. I mean, I
don't know
I
an
know,
engineer that would say that.
there's
I
anecdotal
just don't know.
evidence of a lot of things, but correlation is not always causation. There's a lot of stuff going on and things that, I mean, I don't understand, but I do know that we've talked about this extensively and that every expert has said it's not. I guess what I'd like to ask is, and I feel like we're definitely Monday morning quarterbacking this thing in a big way, but if we could go back, knowing what we know today, if we saw ourselves in, or what was the date or the year that we could have said, like, I understand that in 2018, it didn't look, it would not be reasonable to add sand to the south end. It sounds like that's what everybody has said, and I can only imagine, the uproar of people of, oh my gosh, you're adding all this sand to a perfectly good beach, and, now we have to carry our bags farther and all of that. But I mean, those are actually legitimate things that people are going to complain about. And not to mention the turtles and the everything, there's other issues that come into play. But was there a time where we could look at these graphs and we could say, post 2018, like, oh, this is starting to go downhill. And if it does continue on this slope, that now's the time to act. Like, could we have, because that's where, when we started this group, that's kind of where I thought we were going with this, was, do we have some sort of plan, some sort of, whether it means having the permits, sitting there ready to go, that we could have pulled the trigger, a year ahead of time. And then you also have to, that's, in some ways, I think in the South End, we have this like perfect storm that's happened. And we're waiting on the Corps of Engineers project, it was supposed to happen 6 months ago. And, there's a lot of things, and there's also meteorology. I mean, my gosh, the weathermen aren't right for what it's gonna be like tomorrow, much less what it's gonna be like next year. So I guess, keeping all of that in mind, is there something that we could have done, reasonably could have done in, let's say, 2020, if the world wasn't shut down and we were living in a normal world? I mean, there's a lot of things that came into this. I mean, that, I really do think, I hope that this is not something that we're gonna see again. But is there something we can do so that if we start to see this again, we have a trigger and we have things that we can do faster than where we are now?
And I think we lost sand low in the profile for a couple of years, to your point. Could we kind of identify, okay, we're not seeing it because it's underwater and it's out in the profile, but we have now lost, and I'm just gonna throw a number. We lost 100,000, and then the next year we lost 100,000. Okay, that's, whatever that number is, say, okay, that is now our trigger. We've seen
Now
this
we're- yeah,
once.
now we're concerned, and
Let's
now-
start the
That triggers the maintenance is what Steve's talking about.
Is that, Stephen, from your perspective, I mean, is that an identifiable kind of metric that we could look into exactly what happened and come up with a trigger that we would at least go to council and say, we've now lost 100,000 cubic yards, if that's the number, for 2 years in a row. This is the same trend we saw in 2023, 4. Start it now and give council that. Is that an identifiable metric?
Yeah, I think it's identifiable, and I think in a lot of cases, it would be useful. I think there may be cases where even that number may not, like, it may be a number that comes in under that, but the beach condition isn't what we would want it to be either. So I think having that kind of, monitoring and trigger based, I mean, you want to look at the total beach volume, you want to go look at year-to-year changes to see if there are accelerations and things, but really, that to some extent, that's kind of separate from, you need to be planning for a renourishment project every some number of years and expect a certain cost, and and then if it's warranted, okay, do it, and if it's not, great, we have money in the bank for the next hurricane or when the time does come.
Hey, Steve, can I ask you a quick question?
If that,
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm just, maybe I'm oversimplifying, I'm kind of going back to the comments. I'm kind of with, going back in the past isn't going to do anybody any good. I think we can learn from the past, but.
I'm sorry, can you speak a little
Yeah.
slower there?
So I'm kind of with everybody else on, I think, learning from the past is great, but I think it goes back to what I was trying to frame, and I don't want to oversimplify it early on in the meeting, was, don't we really need to get that, what's it going to take to get us to that first baseline, to get us to the 400 or 450 cubic yards per foot or whatever that is, to get the ideal beach across the entire, I think to what Philip said, across the entire beach, and I think that's a great approach. But then the next one is the parameters of, okay, based on the erosion rates that based on the surveys that based on the monitoring that we see, we can come up with what is the maintenance plan going forward, which hopefully is going to be less than doing a major renourishment. If we can do the maintenance program, maybe we don't have to do a big renourishment every 5 or 10 years that costs an enormous amount of money, which is kind of the Dare County program. The triggers that we're talking about, if we put that plan in place and we deviate from the plan with either an accelerated erosion rate during any given year or something, those triggers can be put in the plan that says if we're exceeding this, we're going to have to move up the maintenance program on this part of the beach. And maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but it seems to me like that's kind of what we're trying to develop, isn't it?
Yeah, that seems logical, and we're trying to make a solid budget as we go forward.
Exactly.
So,
I think that even in the maintenance plan, there are some areas, particularly the inlets, where the maintenance plan will include a large-scale offshore dredging project, which that's what technically impacts the cost of that project if you have to bring a dredge. But coordinating it, part of the plan, and coordinating it where you do the north and south at the same time, which is when you look at our 10-year capital plan, that's how we're planning for the north end to have a major project at the same time so that we can minimize the cost of the mobilization. But based on those numbers, when you look at the cubic yard costs of our last project, we're looking at a $15 million project for the north end and maybe a $13 million for the south end. Those numbers could be reduced significantly if we do it at the same time. Not the entire portion of the Wild Dunes project would fall on the city, but that is, we're looking at numbers between $17 and $20 million for the next 5 years of needing to be able to supplement the sand that's been lost on both the north and the south end, which is where, based on the surveys and the data, the areas that need it at this point.
And I guess, Stephen, I hate that Dan had to leave, because if you took the health of our beach right now, I would guess a decent amount of it is probably sitting at 400 or 450 cubic yards.
I think I have that.
Yeah.
Dan said the north end or the east end, whichever way you want to say it, is in bad shape. Well, that's a pretty healthy beach up there, with the exception of Beechwood East. From a
Right.
kind of Tim's point, from a naked eye view, non-engineer view, that beach looks pretty darn healthy. And from 21st to 53rd, it looks very healthy. So, to get this baseline of where are we starting from, is 90% of our beach, at the 450 or 400? I mean, we don't have that answer today, but, because we need to define
That's that squiggly line.
So the squid, yeah, we'll pull it up again.
which squiggly line?
That one.
We have lots of squeaks.
So we got lots.
Oh, I have a question. It's,
So Mayor, if you look at that,
So that's the,
And when was this done, though? How old is this?
so it includes March,
How old is that?
so that includes March
March
24 data, so about a month ago.
I don't think anybody watching can't see what you're doing, right? But anyway.
so this graph is showing you that line is
That-
the magic line at 450. We're talking
Right.
about making it 400, which would be this line. So this orange line shows those parts of the island that are below 450 or 400. And this kind of far end is Breach Inlet, so you can see there's there's a drip here that's below. And then I think Stephen we don't have it for the northern end, but you can see there's kind of a few spikes that go below 450. So there are
I mean, so a
certain
large
points-
majority of our beach is very healthy. And I guess, when you think about determining what the healthy beach profile is, our historical erosion rate is going to be, I mean, at some point, kind of to the conversation about Breach Inlet a little bit, at some point, what does success look like? 80% of our beach always healthy, 90% always healthy? I mean, there are just going to be periods where erosion rates are things we haven't seen before, like we have for the last couple of years. But, Douglas, I'm thinking back to your comment, if in 2018, if we'd have come to council and said, we need to spend an extra $3 or $4 million to put sand on the Breach Inlet end, there's no way that would have been approved. No way. I mean, I can't even imagine that would have been approved. But anyway,
So I think
I mean-
Maybe this happens 3 years from now, we would.
That's, I
Maybe,
wonder if
you
we
know.
could- If we could kind of document this episode well enough, so I have my kind of staff hat on.
yeah.
And I think this kind of framework of what I'm hearing Scott say and Desiree saying is kind of let's get the beach through until we do a major project. At that time, we're going to have spent $5 million of mobilization. Let's plan on getting the entire stretch to whatever this number is. It sounds like it was maybe 450, maybe it's 400. That's kind of the baseline setting, and I think we can go back and analyze what that would cost. And then identify the triggers, to Katie's point, of kind of look back in the rearview mirror and say, okay, and I don't know the numbers here, but if we lose beach down in that profile for two sequential years and it's X amount, that kind of raises the flag, that would then initiate a process where we would start looking at options and coming to you all for, okay, this is the same pattern we saw in 2023, 24. And then we can try to kind of put a dollar amount to each of these and then see how short we are.
Yeah, the math's not that hard.
Yeah.
It really isn't. So Stephen, quick question. Sorry, Douglas. Let me just ask this. So are we saying the 450 was a dart throw, I guess, but are we saying 400 is more comfortable? Because when you look at the graph, large majority of our beach would be considered healthy at that point. I mean, are we kind of settling at 400, or is 450 really a better number?
I'd like to see them both. if
Yeah.
that's-
No, I agree with that,
And
just
I
a
don't
starting
know-
point, but I want to hear Stephen. I mean, what's your,
Financial difference between
Right.
4 versus 450.
but Stephen,
What other beaches are doing,
Yeah,
where have they
Stephen-
set theirs as a benchmark?
Stephen, what's your view of the 4 to 450?
I think 400 is a more appropriate number based off of where, if you look a couple of years ago, where the condition was, most of those stations were right around that 400 number, and everybody felt pretty good about it. It was only once we started to get below that in recent years where we felt like we've had yeah, okay, no, we're not happy with that beach
Yeah.
condition. But just based off of that, I think that 400 numbers there, there's been plenty of places down there, that have not even been at 450 in any time in the past, several years. So I think that number was a little high.
And I guess to Scott's point, how would that compare to Pauley's or Folly or, somebody else if, again, I think our beach is pretty healthy. but-
It's a little different because, beach slopes are different. So the beach slope is what helps determine how much volume per linear foot you have. So like at a Stowe, they have a much steeper beach slope, so they're gonna have a much lower, profile volume
Gotcha.
for comparable dune widths.
Well, and one of the other reasons,
It's not always comparable from one beach to the other.
Yeah.
But
I
I
think-
will say that, there's, on, like I mentioned earlier, the aesthetic side or the more, just kind of overall view of the beach, the town of Edisto and those folks down there are not used to having 2 or 3 dunes in front of their house, and they're much more
No dunes.
comfortable with a lower relative beach health, because that's what they've just been accustomed to.
Yeah.
And
And we've suggested to them, and the Corps of Engineers has suggested to them, building dunes higher, and they don't want high dunes because it may block their view. So there is a little bit of a, art to that based off the local preference.
well, the other driver, Steve, that I was looking for is, I think in the Dare County model, they, and I don't know the answer to this, 400 may be fine. Does that extra 50 buy us an extra 2 years? How much time does it buy before we have to go out and spend a whole lot more money in order to, do the deployment? And I don't know the answer to that. Does 50 yards get us, for $2 million? Does it help us push out 2-3 more years to have to spend another 10 million? I don't know the answer to that. It's just something that would be nice to see.
And can I follow up
Yeah,
on?
well, really, it doesn't, and this is kind of what I was saying earlier, it doesn't necessarily work like that, because that's your new baseline, that anything in the future is the erosion rate that you're applying on top of it. So whether you start your project at 400 or whether you start your project at 450,
You'll add to it.
you're adding
Yeah.
sand to account for a certain amount of loss that you're anticipating over the next time frame.
Got it.
So it does affect
the
your
erosion
initial
rates.
construction.
Yeah.
But in theory, it shouldn't affect your future nourishment schedule, because that's purely based on erosion that should be occurring seaward of whatever that minimum is that you establish.
I have a quick question for you, because I can't visualize it.
Stephen, there's another question.
450 yard, how does that equate to the dry sandy beach? So you put 450 cubic yards in, what does that leave us with? Do we have 20 feet of sandy beach at high tide, or what's that number?
I would, Stephen, Stephen, quick add on to that. So just looking at your graph of health, kind of beach volume, it is peculiar to me that the Grand Pavilion area is showing under the 450 line in 2019. And I'm thinking that in 2019, that was a year after the nourishment, there was like a football field of sand out there. So that kind of to carry on to Tim's question, I guess that's because it was a shallow berm and not a ton of volume in it, but
In terms of lengths?
There's a couple of things that could affect that. I guess to get to the first question, your dry beach width in theory, again, in that kind of setting, every cubic yard per foot of sand that you add will get you about 1.5 feet of beach width. So if you add 100 cubic yards of sand, that will push the beach out about 150 feet or so. Now, as far as dry sand, if you have dunes and vegetation, eventually that vegetation may grow out, and your actual recreational beach will shrink up to wherever the tide line is. But you take
Can you
away all
repeat
the
that?
vegetation and the dunes.
Yeah,
the-
yeah, Stephen, say that about the dune again, please.
Can you
say that math one more time, Stephen.
Can you repeat the math?
Sorry.
Repeat that math, Stephen.
Yeah, so for every cubic yard per foot of sand, you get about 1 to 1.5, 1.5 is the closer number, feet of beach width. So if you do a nourishment project that has 100 cubic yards per foot, then you should have about 150 feet of dry sand beach width. So if you're 400 to 450 difference, that buys you about 70 feet, 75 feet of dune width or dry sand beach width is the difference there.
And
So I think-
Stephen,
oh,
oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead, I'm sorry.
Stephen, there was one more thing you said about the dune, like the height of the dune can affect the width of the beach. Is that correct, as it vegetates and grows?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
You talked about the dune size, the size of the dune, or the height of the dune, and the way it would vegetate could affect the width of the beach. But if I understood you correctly, that you potentially could have a very healthy dune and a narrower dry sand beach. Is that correct? Or is it possible?
Yeah, if you took away, pedestrians and people on the beach, the vegetation line will tend to equilibrate just landward of the spring high tide line.
Okay.
So on a spring tide, on even a healthy beach, if you have a healthy vegetated dune, you're going to get vegetation right up to that point where the spring tide line is. On a neat tide, you would have more of a dry sand beach because the tide's not going to come up that high. If you, like what we're seeing along the southern avenues right now, from 4th Avenue up to 9th Avenue right now, that beach is in a recovery phase where it was eroded, so you had dune escarpment, and the beach lowered, and now that it's building back, you have this wide, dry, sandy beach area. But over time, those dunes, if we didn't do anything, those dunes would reform, regrow, revegetate, and you would lose a lot of that sandy beach area to vegetated dune area, which, is a good thing from the engineering side, but
Yes.
a little less room to put your umbrella.
So that leads me to the next question. So we're talking about the 400 cubic yards per linear foot of beach versus 450. If we increase the volume of sand that we put on the beach to do this, like, let's say, initial renourishment, and we concentrate on engineering that dune to protect those properties, like which is a big concern of everyone on the island that are in these threatened areas, could be money well spent, putting that extra sand to develop and engineer a proper dune. Then we're not, maybe in the future, worried or as concerned about the dry sand beach. It could help with our future plan 10, 20 years down the road, protecting property, correct?
Yeah, correct. When any beach nourishment project, you're looking at firm ways and trying to get that dry sand out there. But the goal is to restore a protective dune, vegetate it, promote additional dune growth in the future. But that's the sign of a healthy beach.
Okay, thank you.
So, hey, Stephen, or maybe committee, are there some modeling we'd like to see next based on the 450, the 400, and the erosion rate that Stephen threw out of 50,000 yards per year? I mean, is that kind of next step?
I think that's what we've been talking about since we first started.
Yeah, I think to
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
at least some parameters and start applying a financial aspect to it, kind of, Katie, to your point, we're going to start this conversation months ago. I mean, that feels like kind of the next step to give us some guidelines based on your feedback, Stephen. I mean, is that
I would agree.
fair?
Do we also, though, like, in the very beginning, you mentioned the fact that this is for, quote, the whole beach. I
I'm
feel
sorry, I
like,
broke up for a minute. If there was a question there for me.
No. We're
no, just kind of, yeah, just chatting. But I do kind of, a little bit of a question, I guess, for something that I do think would be helpful to see is looking at the entire beach. We've been so focused on the bad spots, and obviously so, I mean, rightfully so at this point in a crisis situation, but I think for planning purposes moving forward, it probably would be good to look at the whole entire beach and see where we are. I assume, but I could be wrong, that, most of the middle of the island is in that good spot, healthy. But we also probably we do need to be looking at that and making sure that we're not missing anything there. I mean, I know.
That we're not
I
ignoring
know-
something, yeah.
I know that you guys are monitoring all of that, but I do kind of feel like we should take more, at least one time, a holistic look at this.
Stephen, to that end, could you complete do you have the information you would need to complete that graphic?
The orange
The
line.
orange line or some new
Bring it
line?
Current, yeah.
For the Wild Dunes Inn, do you have that information, or did you have to survey to get that? I can't recall.
We would have to survey, and our next scheduled survey was, around July or August, for our annual monitoring, so
Should move that up,
we
maybe.
have that data then, but could
Could we move that? Would it
do
be,
that up.
yeah, we could move that up. There's no downside to moving that survey up? Is it just busier, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we like to have similar season comparisons, just because it accounts for changes you get in the beach profile from summer to winter, but it's not the end of the world. That's why we survey all the way out into the waters. You account for shifting in the sandbars during the winter, that type of thing. So yeah, that could be done, pretty easily.
I mean, I think without it, aren't we going to be just
And
guessing?
looking at the entire beach does
Seems like-
provide good context for both for how healthy the healthy sections are and how eroded the eroded sections are.
So Stephen, that,
And there's places like,
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say there's places like, the area around the Windjammer and up to the pier that, right now still are not really much of a concern, but should erosion, kind of unexpected erosion manifest there in the future, there are areas to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
And Doug, to go back to your question about the beach volume that kind of dips at the Grand Pavilion, some of that is because the structures there stick a little bit further out than their neighbors. These volumes are relative to those structure lines, so if you have a particular profile that the structures are further out, you're going to have a lower relative volume there. So a lot of that is because of that type of thing.
But Stephen, is it my imagination? It's a huge beach. In 2019, like, I feel like there was football fields in front of Grand Pavilion, and it's showing just maybe 425? Does that seem right?
Yeah.
I was just up there
What I'm
recently.
seeing, it looks in front
I
of
think it's
the
like
pavilion, we're about
Yeah.
550 in 2019.
I do have one final question. We keep looking at this chart that shows the volume, the beach volume over the different reaches, 2019, 2021, 2023, and then the latest survey from south of the pier from March. And when you're comparing the orange line, which represents the latest data from last March with August of 2023, it looks like the beach profile, between Breach Inlet and, is it 20, maybe 6th Avenue or 10th Avenue, has increased. Is that something that you would look and say that erosional cycle that you could see in inlets is sort of shifting and improving in terms of the volume?
Where do you see it increasing at?
Compared to all, between March
Black line
and,
relative to the orange line?
yes, between, August of last year and March of this year. That line in some reaches it's improving in terms of the comparison between those two survey points.
Like right at 5th and 6th, it's actually more sand now than it was for the prior two, 21 and 23, which is
Yeah.
surprised by that.
Yeah, right at 6th, it is pretty similar. Now, there's a dip in 6th Avenue, and then there's another dip a little to the left of that. And that's because those stations were OCRM monitoring stations that we've surveyed in the past. For this survey, we increased our survey stations from every 1,000 feet to every 500 feet in that area and eliminated those OCRM stations, so we would have higher resolution data there and more consistent data. So that right at that spike there at 6th Avenue, that's kind of an artifact that over time will work itself out. But if you look at the two black dots on either side of that dip, those are survey stations that we've surveyed for a long time. There, the orange dot is just barely above the black dot. So that beach has been very stable or gaining just a little bit of sand at that particular station.
I think we have some
Thank you.
Anytime you get into the
takeaways
weeds of the city, there's a lot of
next.
little.
Like as in staff?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, so kind of what I'm seeing that we could bring back to this group is data on, that kind of lets you all decide, is 400 or 450 the right number? And I think, Scott, you were saying just kind of the cost differential for each. And then I think a guess with, working with Stephen as to what that would have done to the cadence. So in other words, do you get significantly longer if you go 50,000 extra cubic yards? So we'll work on kind of giving you information, but on each of those options in terms of cost and durability of each. Katie, to your point, I think we had some work on trying to kind of Monday morning quarterback on the loss on this end and see if we can kind of cipher out some triggers that in hindsight would have been useful to say, okay, we've lost X amount in this many years. Same trend, do we want to address it? So I think that's kind of a second takeaway. And then a little bit of an analysis, and again, from a staff's perspective, I think that if the decision that was made in 2018 to not spend money on this end, would we do that differently, knowing kind of now what we know? And could we, you know, and we always know that people, when the beach is big, that worry goes away, the willingness to kind of spend a lot of money, potentially it's a future council that didn't live through this. So if we can kind of memorialize what happened and provide that as a body of evidence of, you know, hey, this is what happened, this is what we could have done, do you want to spend this money or do you not? But we could at least kind of provide a future council that information and example as for consideration.
I mean, I think that whole information is important as we develop the maintenance plan moving forward. Is you take into account potential erosional cycles in an area that is unstable, and then you plug that in. I mean, I think that, you know, historically it's been accretional. We had this 2 years, and we shouldn't really count on those. But I think that they need to be incorporated in the formula in a reasonable way to make sure that, you know, this happened, so it could happen again. So how do we mitigate it before we get to that point, moving forward?
Can I just ask one question? The initial nourishment, pricing it out, whether we pick 4 or 450, it's gonna be a gap. But then, Steve, when you do the initial renourishment, do you need to know, you know, we talked about the 10-year cycle, the 5-year cycle. That initial renourishment, you have to put the baseline, whatever you decide, plus something on top of that to allow for that 5-year or 10-year cycle. Is that correct? And that, do you need that information first before we do that, or is that something we talk about at the next? You see what I'm saying?
I do, but
It's baseline plus.
that's the erosion rate,
It's
right?
the erosion rate.
And the
We can run
4 to
various
450
scenarios
buffer.
For renourishment intervals, whether it's 5-year, 10-year, and what those volumes would look like. And we come up with graphs on out-year costs, and at some point those numbers, you know, those lines likely cross on, you know, more frequent projects are going to be more expensive over the long term. But yeah, that's simple to do. Now, we kind of, we're approached considering what affects this core project. This core project essentially is going to restore any of the deficit volume and likely a fair amount more than we're looking at here. So, you know, in the ideal world, I kind of like to wait to see how that project got in, and we can actually quantify how much sand stayed on was on the beach and within the system there, and then start basing our future projections off of that. But we can certainly run the scenario now, kind of as if that project's not going to happen. But I really do feel like this project's going to be a fairly substantial effort, but maybe a little lower than we would, if we were to design it right now from scratch. It might be a little lower volume, but not,
Gonna help.
it's probably within 75% of the volume that we would have,
Free.
likely added under a standalone project, so.
So it does, I mean, looking into the future, it does appear, I mean, just kind of hearing this play out, hadn't really thought about it, that a future council is probably going to be left with this same consideration of, we're going to be doing the Wild Dunes work in a couple of years. There's a lot of indications that the majority of the sand, or a lot of the sand from the Army Corps project will be there. And a council is going to have to decide, do we spend, 3, 4, 5 extra million to pump onto that in this end? And I mean, it's kind of like we're setting up for this exact decision.
But I think, Douglas, to Katie's point earlier, and everybody's really, if we can just come up with parameters to say, what are our trigger points? What are our cost assumptions? I mean, again, none of that's that hard. It's just, you got to decide which ones you want to use, and then what are your triggers to have permits in hand and go at it. And if it comes to a council in the future and they say no, then so be it. But
Yeah.
at least there's a Bible to go by.
Yeah,
at
to
some
me, the
point.
most important trigger is when do we start the permitting process?
Right.
If we see X number of cubic yards lost
Yeah.
in this year, we started, and then if it becomes accretional the next 2 years, then we don't need to act on it, but at least we've started that process, I guess, to the point that we've been discussing.
Yeah,
I
there's at
think
least
the
a
goal would be
plan.
to maintain the dunes, because once the dunes are the last defense. So if we can stop the dunes from disappearing, I think that would be a goal for the triggering.
Stephen, you're going to say something? Go ahead.
Stephen, are you available to come to the next meeting next Friday? So that we can maybe present the economics and financial analysis of the 400 or 450?
That seems pretty quick, but okay.
So there's a bigger question behind me. It's, can you do all the work that would be necessary
to
to
make this
Yeah.
Friday's on the landing.
I was going to say, let's push it out.
maybe
Push it
give
2
us
weeks?
2
Yeah,
weeks
give a couple weeks.
to work on all of this? And Stephen, I don't know if 2 weeks from now would be realistic to have done some of this analysis and be able to
Yeah,
be here?
Landing.
that should be enough time to do that. Is that the,
This
18th?
17th, yeah, 2 weeks from today.
Yeah. I think I'm available that day.
You leave 8.
Yeah.
You're not here.
That week's
I can
getting
call
out.
I can call in 2 weeks, like next week.
Okay,
You're
we
out,
can do,
okay.
so
Yeah,
the 17th.
So let's plan on next meeting, 17th at 9.
Next Friday?
No,
two
the 17th.
Fridays.
17th.
2 Fridays.
That's-
Give us time to work.
Yeah,
Thank you, Steve.
anytime. Stephen, always.
Thank you.
Bye,
All right,
Stephen.
We
All
are,
right, thank you. Apologize for not being there.
Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
All right, be safe.
and we are off record at 10:16, but
I can be here for about 45 minutes next
hang
Friday.
on till we get offline.
We're doing 2 Fridays.